In this video, we're going to look at a small segment from one of the masterclasses. If you want to see the full masterclass, just go through the channel and I'm sure you'll find it somewhere. Otherwise, make sure you subscribe and you'll know whenever next we publish some free content to this channel. Thank you. Enjoy. 25 years ago, 26 years ago, I spent some time at MTV. In those days, MTV was hot in Europe and all over the world. It was changing the way people viewed music, but also particularly the pacing of videos, and TV changed as MTV introduced a rapid, frenetic editing style. And this is what John Chapin had to say about it. Like most media innovations, critics soon warned of deleterious effects on unsuspecting youthful consumers, shortened attention spans, and sexual recklessness. So we want to talk about the latter. We're going to talk about that shorter attention span and what we can do about it. Now, you may already have guessed, there's one way of dealing with it in the way MTV suggested to us: fast editing. Now, that's outside the writer's control. Now, I mentioned we're going to learn from Milos, and this is a clip from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and you may not immediately recognize it because this is the rare sequence right in the middle of the film where we leave the asylum. It's a 20-minute mid-sequence where McMurphy and his mates go on a fishing trip, and then after that they also play a game of basketball. When Milos Forman screened the film for the first time, he screened the first edit, he was concerned that the segment ran for too long and the movie was getting too bulky and he didn't like it. So he tried cutting it shorter and shorter and shorter and cut it out, and the impact was actually quite the opposite. It actually slowed it down. Cutting things shorter is not always the solution to a problem of pacing and rhythm. You may have already noticed that when you watch the director's cuts of your favorite movies. Sometimes a film gets released in the cinemas in its studio cut, in a shorter version, it doesn't work. And then the director's version is released, often playing for a much longer time, and then that does work. Cutting things out and make it shorter doesn't always fix a problem of pacing or rhythm. It is, sometimes you can go too fast, sometimes you can be too slow. Now, do you remember from our class about fractal structure? Here is just a rough outline of what could be a tension graph of a full-length feature film, where the top tension reaches the 100% point, so that's the highest tension you reach in the film, and then over the course of the film that fluctuates. So you see how we have peaks and troughs, and just before the end of the film, we reach the climax. Now, if you were to set that out on a timeline, you will notice that on average, there is some rhythm to those peaks. They don't occur and then there's nothing for half an hour and then there's two within 5 minutes. There is a cadence. There's a certain rhythm. There's a meter almost to the peaking of the sequence climaxes. And if we then look at our own preferred structural model, you'll see that that pretty much coincides with the end of each sequence. Within those sequences, you can still sometimes feel that things are stalling. And why is that? Here we go. The formula for pacing, P, looks like this. It is S divided by T. Now, what does that mean? Pacing comes down to number of story beats per units of time. So the more story beats you have in your film, the faster it's going to feel. If you don't have enough story material, your film will feel slow. No matter how many car chases or shootouts you build in, there is no story progressing, and therefore your film will feel slow and the pacing will stall. So how many story beats do you need? Well, people say in terms of dramatic scenes, with major turns, you need between 40 and 60. So 40 and 60 for a feature film of about 100 minutes. So it gives you about one every 2 minutes on average. Now that is it. That's an old average. That was suggested by Robert McKee when he published his book Story. But to my taste, that hasn't really changed over the years. It's really the editing style that has changed, not so much the material included in films. If you watch Billy Wilder's films, and The Apartment is a really good example, you will notice that there's a lot of story going on. It goes really fast. Now, there are certain films that kind of escape that keeping a certain rhythm. This was from The Legend of Buster Scruggs, a recent film by the Coen brothers. Languid, takes its time. You know, you're admiring the countryside, but you're wondering how much longer is this going to run for? And you feel there's no real story going on. So we're looking at something that takes a sizable amount of time with a minimal amount of story. So you see that in our formula of pacing, this is going to go right towards the zero. And that feels slow to most people. I mean, there are other people who don't mind meditating on the image and, you know, just immerse yourself and let go and surrender. But that's not your regular movie audience, so we need some story. The reason I showed this film is actually different. I'll ask you, where do you think this clip was taken from? How many minutes into the film would this be? Where would you expect this to sit? You'd say the beginning. But no, this is somewhere in the middle of the movie. How is that possible? How can you have something like that right in the middle of the movie? It's because The Legend of Buster Scruggs is not an ordinary film. It's an anthology film. It combines a number of short stories, and the result, to my taste and to the taste of James Berardinelli, is that in a theater with no fast-forwarding button inside, the film might seem to run a little long. And if we were to do the graph, you'll see that the peaks and troughs are not as equally spread out. So it doesn't have that rhythm of a normal feature film. But what's most interesting about this graph is that after each story, we return back to zero or close to zero. And we need to start building again. And that just kills the pacing. It kills the overall pacing of the experience. So when you go to see an anthology film, you're actually going to sit through a session of short films. And that's a completely different mindset. If you know that and you're prepared for it, that's fine. People accept it. And there are quite a number of lovers of this particular film of the Coen brothers. But you can imagine that it's not necessarily mainstream. Worse is when it's not intended as such, but it has the effect. It's something you want to avoid. And this is when we get to the film Wawa. That was the film based on actor Richard E. Grant's memories, childhood memories from his time in Africa, in Swaziland. And we're going back to the same reviewer for his verdict. He says, despite everything that happens between the opening and end credits, the unevenness of the pacing results in a production that feels longer than its 97 minutes. Now, I look at 97 minutes and go like, what? I watched that film. That was not 97 minutes. It was an epic film. It felt like, you know, these epic biographies that span decades and that make you feel like you know the person and you know the country. To me, it felt like that film had run for 2 or 3 hours. But no, you take out the credits, it's barely over 90 minutes. And that's what happens with this particular type of film that is episodic, that is based on shards of memories, that doesn't have a strong dramatic through line. And you'll see that in poor adaptations, let's say. Sam says, I found The French Dispatch suffered from this too. Wes Anderson has that at times, I find, yeah. It's really critical to have one clear underlying story that takes us through and that will keep up the momentum. And that's not just for Hollywood cinema. This goes for independent, low-budget films just as much. And I'm going to show you a clip from a film that I go back to quite frequently. Frozen River. It's a story of a mother whose husband disappears with the money that was saved up to pay for their trailer home. And he goes to gamble it and he doesn't return. So she's left with the kids. The story is set on the border with Canada. the mother who is a racist can only find one way to make that money, and that is by smuggling people, helping a Mohawk woman crossing the river, the frozen river. This is a scene from early in the film, and there's a hint to a very powerful technique to build and maintain momentum in your film, no matter what the budget, no matter what the style.
All ready for you.
Just need that balloon payment to unload?
We have it. It's just they called Troy from Titus last night, the ski place.
Oh, do you have the $4,372 or not?
It was some emergency with the lift, and he just took off out of here without thinking with the money. Completely forgot you were coming, so as soon as he gets back...
When's he getting back?
Well, when you come with the other half, I'll have it.
You don't get the other half until I get the cash. This is the second time you dragged me out here. If you can't come up with it by Christmas, you have lost your $1,500 deposit.
Look, Mr. Versailles, I've got a good job at Yankee $1. They're probably going to make me manager right after Christmas, so I can definitely make the payments. If you just leave the house.
Just call me when you have the balloon payment.
I'll call you.
What did you notice in that scene that is a powerful technique to build momentum? I'll give you a hint. This is the page of the script, and I'll zoom in on what we are actually talking about. If you don't come up with it by Christmas, you've lost your $1,500 deposit. So the stakes are tied to a deadline. Remember my email? Deadlines. Deadlines, ticking clocks are incredibly powerful in terms of building momentum and keeping that tension up. Now the audience has something to anticipate. And although we sometimes associate independent films, and yesterday we were talking about period dramas, with being slow, it doesn't necessarily need to be. It has to do with story beats per time unit and the techniques you use to keep the attention going. So ticking clocks.
The following takes place between midnight and 1 a.m. on the day of the California presidential primary. Events occur in real time.
I want you to check Darcy's accounts. You can access them through the secured files. Use this. Nina, he's gonna wake up in half an hour or less.
The exact same action will get a higher intensity if you give it a limited time frame. So by projecting a deadline into the future for your audience, there will be the sense of a higher momentum, of a better pacing. In Frozen River, later in the story, we have another ticking clock, and you will also find that in most successful films, the time frame gets shorter. Now, what you can also do, what we learned from reading the Frozen River screenplay and comparing it to the film, is cutting dialogue. Very often, many scenes will have dialogue at the beginning and the end of the scene that was cut out, which in itself is an example of the principle in late, out early. What does that mean? When you write a scene, you ask yourself, what is this scene about? What's the core beat, the story beat that this scene achieves? Now that is going to be as close as possible to the end of the scene. So once you've delivered that beat, you want to stop the scene. And you also don't want too much of an intro. You don't want your meet and greets. Make sure that as much as possible in the scene is dramatic. So you go in as late as possible and you leave early. You also make sure you have tension on different levels. What does that mean? In an anthology film, once one story is over, that's it. There is no more tension. There's no underlying question. There's no other bigger story that will keep our attention going. In any successful feature film, you will have tension running from the beginning until the end. There is a question. There's something that keeps us going, even if there's a temporary relief. A scene can be resolved. A scene can come to a conclusion, but at the end of that scene, we still need to have other questions remaining that play on a different level, so multi-level tension. And then there's the trick, the technique of 1-2, 1-2, 1-2. What does that mean? We're all familiar with the 3-act structure. In the first act, you set up. In the second act, you develop. In the third act, you pay off and you resolve the tension. Now, in the course of your story, you may have many scenes that have their own act structure, that have their own internal act structure. Now, what you try to avoid is to have these scenes resolve. You don't want the vignette structure. You don't want the episodic structure or an anthology structure. So you want to abort the action before it is resolved. You've seen examples of this. You may just not be aware of it. It happens all the time. Great movies have this all the time, and Pixar are absolute masters of it. In this particular masterclass, we have looked at the sequence from Toy Story 2 where Woody goes to save Wheezy, the penguin. Now, that's a story where it starts in the toy room, in the boys' room, Andy's room, and the toy Wheezy is being taken away by Mom. Then Woody starts his mission of rescuing Wheezy, goes outside, takes Wheezy out of the box, but that mini story is never resolved. But because before Woody returns to the room, he himself is being kidnapped. So that mini story is being set up. First act of that mini story, Wheezy's being kidnapped. Second act of the mini story, Woody goes outside to save him, but there is no third act. So that it's aborted. And we go into a new first act for a new story. So you have 1-2, 1-2. You don't have 1-2-3, 1-2-3. So you may have an overall 3-act structure in the bigger picture of the film, but on the level of the scenes, you may abort that. In any case, you can still go to a third act. You can go to a third act climax, but you will not resolve it. You don't want your audience to relax. You still want to maintain the tension as much as possible. And now there's a sneaky trick. This is a sneaky trick because it's really manipulated, but it may work. And I noticed it in a TV show that unfortunately was canned because it was one of my favorite shows at the time, Brain Dead. Brain Dead is a mix of horror and political show, playing, I think, during the elections leading to the Trump presidency. And when you study the pilot episode of that show, what is really interesting is that what is labeled in the screenplay as being the teaser is a very long sequence of more than 20 minutes. And normally a teaser is 3 minutes or less. Here it was more than 20 minutes. The first act was a little bit shorter. The second act was even shorter, and the third act was even shorter. So you have these elements that get progressively shorter. Now, the effect that creates is the action speeding up. So if equal units get shorter, you feel like the pace is picking up. So make your elements short, or be aware at least that you don't want to make them longer. Given that you create a certain rhythm, a certain pacing, a certain cadence, you want that to get shorter. Now, in this context, it's also said that in feature films, often in the first act you may cover months or years. In the second act, you're going to speed that up, and in your final act, you may play it out almost real time, as you're not going to do major time jumps, and that also helps with the pacing. That was today's class. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give us a like. Even better, subscribe to the channel. And if you want to be notified next time we post free content here, make sure you push the bell button. There's a lot more here on this channel. Browse around. We have short snippets. We have full-length 1-hour masterclasses. And there's certainly something in there to your taste. Hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you next time. Bye.